It was supposed to be a simple stop. Fill up the tank, grab a coffee, maybe a lottery ticket, just another Tuesday evening for the 79-year-old man in the worn navy jacket. But when 5 drunk bikers roared into that gas station lot, everything changed. They saw an easy target, a frail old man fumbling with his wallet, so they decided to have some fun. The shove sent him flying into the concrete pillar of pump number 4. The crack his skull made against the metal was loud enough to hear over their laughter. Blood pooled beneath his silver hair as they revved their engines and sped away, leaving him broken and alone on the oil-stained pavement. They thought nobody would care about one forgotten old man. They were catastrophically wrong, because 20 minutes later, 8 silent figures in full tactical gear walked through that gas station door like shadows of war itself. What happened next would remind everyone why you never ever mess with a Navy SEAL, even a retired one. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Frank "Iron" Morrison pulled his weathered Ford pickup into the Chevron station en route. At 79, his movements were deliberate, careful, not from weakness, but from a lifetime of precision that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Vietnam and countless classified missions afterward. His faded navy jacket bore no flashy patches, just the simple anchor insignia most people glanced over without recognition. Frank had been making this same stop every Tuesday for the past 8 years. Fill up the tank, grab black coffee if Helen was working the night shift, maybe buy a scratch-off ticket. Simple routine for a simple life in retirement. What he didn't know was that this Tuesday would be different. This Tuesday would remind him that some wars never really end. The gas station sat at the intersection of 2 lonely highways, surrounded by nothing but desert sage and distant mountains. It was the kind of place truckers used for fuel and locals used for convenience, where everyone minded their own business and trouble was rare. That's why Helen Martinez, the 43-year-old night cashier, liked working there. Quiet shifts, familiar faces, predictable rhythm. She watched through the bulletproof glass as Frank slowly began filling his tank at pump 4. He moved with that particular carefulness of men whose bodies remembered battles their minds tried to forget. Helen had seen him here dozens of times over the years, always polite, always paying in exact change, never causing trouble. He had the bearing of someone who'd seen real violence and wanted no part of it anymore. But tonight, violence would find him anyway. The rumble started as a distant thunder, growing louder until it became unmistakable. The roar of multiple motorcycle engines pushed hard. Helen looked up from her magazine as 5 Harley-Davidsons swept into the parking lot like a pack of predators. Their riders were loud, drunk, and clearly looking for trouble. The leader was a mountain of a man called Tank, 350 pounds of muscle and rage wrapped in black leather. His crew followed behind Spider, Razor, Bones, and a younger hothead they called Nitro. They'd been drinking since noon at a bar 50 miles up the highway, celebrating Nitro's birthday with increasingly bad decisions. Tank spotted Frank immediately. "Look at that," he called to his crew, pointing at the elderly man carefully replacing the gas cap on his truck. "Old-timers got military patches. Bet he's got some stories." Spider laughed, already pulling off his helmet. "Yeah, probably about how they used to win wars back in his day." They approached Frank with the swagger of men who'd never faced real consequence. Their boots were loud on the concrete, their voices carrying across the parking lot with casual menace. "Hey, old man," Tank called out. "Nice jacket. What war did you lose?" Frank looked up from securing his gas cap. His steel-gray eyes took in the 5 men surrounding him, assessing, calculating, preparing, but instead of fear, there was only calm. He'd faced worse odds in jungles where the enemy was invisible and death came without warning. "Evening, gentlemen," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Beautiful night for a ride." The politeness seemed to irritate them. Nitro, barely 25 and drunk on beer and bravado, stepped closer. "Don't change the subject, Gramps. We asked you a question. What's with all the military bullshit?" Frank's expression didn't change. "I served my country for 23 years. That's all you need to know." "23 years of what?" Razor sneered. Peeling potatoes? Filing paperwork? The other bikers laughed, emboldened by alcohol and group dynamics. They moved closer, forming a semicircle that cut off Frank's path to his truck door. Inside the station, Helen watched with growing alarm. She'd seen confrontations before, but something about this felt different. Dangerous. Her hand moved toward the phone, then hesitated. These weren't the kind of men who appreciated police intervention, and Frank hadn't asked for help. But everything was about to change. Tank grabbed Frank's shoulder with a meaty hand. "You know what I think, old man? I think you're just another fake hero. Another wannabe who bought his jacket at a thrift store." Frank looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then back up at Tank. His voice remained level, but something steel-hard entered his eyes. "I'm going to ask you once to remove your hand." The bikers burst into laughter. "Or what?" Tank tightened his grip. "You gonna call your nurse?" That's when Frank made his move. In one fluid motion that defied his age, he stepped back, broke Tank's grip, and moved toward his truck. But he wasn't running. He was positioning Hidsting with the tactical awareness of someone who'd survived because he always thought 3 moves ahead. But Nitro wasn't finished. "Where you going, coward?" the young biker shouted, and before anyone could react, he planted both hands on Frank's back and shoved with all his drunken strength. Frank flew forward, his boots skidding on the oil-stained concrete. He had just enough time to raise his hands before his body slammed into the concrete pillar supporting pump number 4. The impact was devastating. His head struck the metal support with a crack that echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. Frank crumpled to the ground, blood immediately pooling beneath his silver hair. His navy jacket was torn, his face pressed against the cold concrete, his body motionless. The bikers stood frozen for a moment, the severity of what just happened cutting through their alcoholic haze. Then Tank started laughing, a harsh, nervous sound that his crew quickly joined. "Should have minded your own business, Gramps," Tank said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Helen pressed her face against the bulletproof glass, her heart hammering. Blood was spreading across the concrete beneath Frank's head, dark and terrible in the fluorescent light. She reached for the phone, then stopped as Tank's eyes locked onto hers through the window. "Mind your own business, lady," he called out. Old man just took a little spill. The indifference was almost worse than the violence. Other customers at nearby pumps hurried to finish their business, eyes down, unwilling to get involved. A trucker at Pump 2 shook his head and climbed back into his cab. A family with kids in the back seat quickly drove away without filling up. Nobody helped. Nobody called for assistance. Nobody seemed to care that a 79-year-old veteran was bleeding on gas station concrete. The bikers revved their engines, the sound echoing off the station walls like thunder. As they prepared to leave, Nitro leaned down toward Frank's still form. "Next time, show some respect to your betters, old man." They roared away into the desert night, their laughter fading with their engine noise. The parking lot fell silent, except for the distant hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights and the soft drip of blood on concrete. Frank lay motionless for nearly a minute. Then, slowly, impossibly, he began to move. But what the bikers didn't know was that Frank Morrison wasn't just any veteran. His hands pressed against the concrete as he struggled to push himself up. Blood ran down his face, mixing with tears of pain and rage that he quickly wiped away. His head throbbed, his vision swam, but his mind was clear. Frank had been Senior Chief Petty Officer, Frank Morrison, Navy SEAL Team 3. He'd earned his trident in Hell Week at Coronado in 1963, when the program was so brutal that 85% of candidates quit. He'd led deep reconnaissance missions in Vietnam that didn't officially exist. He'd trained a generation of SEALs who went on to lead the most elite special operations units in the world. And he'd been forced to watch in silence as his brothers died in operations that never made the news, their sacrifices unrecognized by a country that would never know their names. Frank pulled himself upright against the concrete pillar, his legs shaking but his resolve hardening. Blood dripped from his scalp onto his torn jacket, but his eyes were clear and focused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a satellite phone, Not the kind civilians carried, but military-grade hardware that connected to networks most people didn't know existed. The call he was about to make would change everything. Frank dialed a number he'd memorized 40 years ago but never thought he'd use again. It rang once. Ghost Base. This is Iron. Authorization Tango 77 Alpha. There was a pause. Iron? Jesus Christ, we thought you were. I'm alive. And I need extraction protocol activated. 5 hostiles. Assault on friendly, civilian location. Frank's voice was steady despite the blood running down his face. Route 47, mile marker 23, Chevron Station. Copy that. Iron. ETA 20 minutes. Medical? Frank touched the back of his head, his fingers coming away bloody. Negative on medical, but I need a full tactical team. These aren't soldiers, they're animals. Understood. Ghost team is inbound. Frank ended the call and leaned against his truck, watching the road where the bikers had disappeared. His head pounded, but a cold smile played at the corners of his mouth. In the station, Helen finally found her courage. She burst through the door, her face pale with concern. "Sir! Oh my God, are you okay? I'm calling." Frank looked at her with eyes that had seen hell and walked out the other side. "Ma'am, that won't be necessary. Help is already on the way." Helen frowned, looking around the empty parking lot. "I don't see any." That's when they heard it. A low, distant rumble that was definitely not motorcycles. The sound grew louder, deeper, more purposeful. It was the kind of sound that made the windows of the gas station vibrate slightly. Frank checked his watch. 18 minutes. His old team still ran on time. 2 black SUVs materialized out of the desert darkness, moving fast but silent except for the whisper of their engines. They had no visible markings, no license plates that Helen could see clearly, and windows tinted so dark they might as well have been solid black. The vehicles stopped in perfect formation, blocking both exits from the parking lot. Doors opened simultaneously, and 8 figures stepped out into the fluorescent light. Helen's breath caught in her throat. These weren't police officers or EMTs. These were warriors. They moved with the fluid precision of men who'd perfected violence as an art form. Their tactical gear was matte black, their faces hard as granite, their eyes scanning the scene with professional assessment. The team leader approached Frank with recognition, and something that might have been relief. He was younger than Frank by 20 years, but he removed his tactical helmet with the respect of a son greeting his father. "Senior Chief," he said quietly. "Good to see you again." Frank nodded, still leaning against his truck. "Commander Hayes, wish it was under better circumstances." Commander David Hayes had been one of Frank's trainees at Coronado 15 years ago. Now he led one of the most elite SEAL teams in the military, the kind of unit that handled problems other special forces couldn't solve. Hayes examined the blood on Frank's head with clinical detachment. Medical assessment: concussion, probable. Laceration, minor. Pride, severely damaged. Frank's voice carried a hint of his old humor. "But I'll live." Hayes nodded to his medic, who immediately began examining Frank's injuries. Then the commander turned his attention to the crime scene, because that's exactly what this had become. Intel on the hostiles. Frank described the 5 bikers in detail that would have impressed a professional investigator. Names, physical descriptions, motorcycle makes and models, even the bar logo on Tank's jacket that would help track their movements. But Hayes was already 3 steps ahead. "Tracker, what do you have?" One of the SEALs looked up from a tablet computer. 5 Harley-Davidsons, eastbound on Route 47. Currently 11 miles out, heading toward the Roadhouse bar. Satellite has them locked. Helen stared in amazement. "How could you possibly?" Hayes glanced at her with the kind of look that suggested she'd already seen and heard too much. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back inside and forget everything you've witnessed here tonight." But Frank placed a gentle hand on Hayes's arm. "She helped, Commander. She was the only one who showed any concern." Hayes nodded curtly. "Understood, Senior Chief." He turned to Helen. "Ma'am, what you're about to witness is classified beyond your clearance level. For your own safety and ours, you need to remain inside until we're finished." Helen looked between Frank and the 8 elite warriors surrounding him. The old man she'd thought was just another retiree was clearly someone very important, someone these dangerous men respected deeply. "What's going to happen to those bikers?" she asked. Hayes's smile was colder than desert winter. "They're going to learn why respect isn't optional." The hunt was about to begin. 2 of the SEALs remained with Frank while the other 6 loaded back into the SUVs. Hayes clasped Frank's shoulder carefully, avoiding his injuries. "We'll handle this, Senior Chief, the way it should be handled." Frank met his eyes. "I know you will, son. That's why I trained you." The SUVs disappeared into the night as silently as they'd arrived, leaving only Frank, Helen, and 2 SEALs who looked like they could fight a small war by themselves. 11 miles away, the bikers were about to discover that some mistakes have consequences that stretch far beyond what civilians can imagine. The Roadhouse Bar was exactly what you'd expect. Loud music, cheap beer, and the kind of atmosphere where violence was entertainment rather than emergency. Tank and his crew had claimed a corner table and were already 3 rounds into celebrating their victory over the old man. "Did you see his face when he hit that concrete?" Nitro was practically bouncing in his chair. "Sounded like a watermelon hitting pavement." The others laughed, though Tank noticed that Spider seemed quieter than usual. The big man had seen real violence before, and something about tonight didn't sit right with him. "Probably gave the old bastard something to think about," Razor added, draining his beer. "Next time maybe he'll show some respect." "Next time he might not be able to walk," Bones said. "Did you see how much blood—" The bar's music cut off mid-song. In the sudden silence, every conversation stopped. Faces turned toward the door, as 2 figures in tactical gear walked in like death itself had come calling. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The figures moved with predatory grace, their eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the corner table where 5 bikers sat frozen with beer glasses halfway to their lips. Commander Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the silent bar. "Gentlemen, I need to speak with the 5 men who were at the Chevron station on Route 47 approximately 30 minutes ago." Tank tried to stand, tried to bluster, tried to maintain the facade of toughness that had carried him through a lifetime of intimidating civilians. But these weren't civilians. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tank said, though his voice cracked slightly. "We've been here all night." Hayes smiled, the kind of expression that made hardened criminals confess their sins. Tank Morrison, age 34, outstanding warrants in 2 states. Spider Kowalski, age 29, on parole for aggravated assault. Razor Williams, age 31, suspended license, 3 DUIs. Bones Patterson, age 28, assault with a deadly weapon. And Marcus Nitro Stevens, age 25, the birthday boy who just committed felony assault on a decorated veteran. The silence in the bar was absolute. Every patron seemed to hold their breath as the reality of the situation sank in. These weren't local cops who could be intimidated or bought off. These were federal operators, and they knew everything. Hayes continued in the same conversational tone. "Now, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the way that ends with you in federal prison for assault on a service member. Your Tank looked around the bar, hoping for support, backup, anything. But every other patron was suddenly very interested in their drinks. The bartender had mysteriously disappeared into the back room. That's when Nitro made his second catastrophic mistake of the evening. "Screw this," he snarled, reaching for the knife on his belt. "I ain't afraid of you, government." He never finished the sentence. Hayes moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in 2 steps. One hand disarmed Nitro while the other applied pressure to a nerve cluster that dropped the young biker to his knees in agony. "Gentlemen," Hayes said calmly, not even breathing hard, "you have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise that right." The second SEAL moved to cover the other 4 bikers, who were smart enough to keep their hands visible and their mouths shut. But Tank's alcohol-soaked brain was still processing what Hayes had said earlier. "What do you mean, decorated veteran? That old man was just some nobody." Hayes looked at him with something approaching pity. "That nobody is Senior Chief Petty Officer Frank Morrison, Navy SEAL, recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star and Bronze Star with V device. He's killed more enemy combatants than you've had hot meals, and he's trained half the special operations community. The blood drained from Tank's face. In layman's terms, Hayes continued, you just assaulted one of the most dangerous men who ever lived. A man who could have killed all 5 of you with his bare hands, even at 79 years old. A man who chose not to, because he left that life behind. Hayes leaned closer, but he called us instead. Spider, who'd been quiet since leaving the gas station, finally found his voice. We didn't know. Jesus Christ, we didn't know. Ignorance isn't a defense, Hayes replied, and assault is assault regardless of who you thought he was. The 5 bikers were zip-tied and escorted to the black SUVs with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time these operators had handled civilian arrests. The other bar patrons watched in stunned silence as men they'd thought were untouchable disappeared into vehicles that would take them to detention facilities they'd never heard of. Back at the gas station, Frank was receiving medical attention. The SEAL medic had cleaned and bandaged his head wound, confirming what Frank already knew: concussion, but not severe. The cut would need a few stitches, but he'd suffered worse injuries shaving. Senior Chief, the medic said, you should really go to a hospital for proper evaluation. Frank shook his head carefully. I've had worse hangovers, Doc. I'll be fine. Helen approached cautiously, still trying to process everything she'd witnessed. Mr. Morrison, those men, they called you Senior Chief. Were you really in the Navy SEALs? Frank looked at her with those steel-gray eyes that had seen too much. For 23 years, ma'am. But that was a long time ago. Why didn't you tell those bikers? Why didn't you fight back? Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the distant lights of vehicles on the highway. Because I'm tired of fighting, ma'am. I've done enough violence for one lifetime. I just wanted to buy gas and go home. But they hurt you. They could have killed you. Yes, ma'am, they could have. And if this had happened 30 years ago, they would have been dead before they hit the ground. Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, not boastful. But I made a choice when I retired. I chose to be a civilian, to let other people handle the violence. Helen frowned. But you called those soldiers. Frank smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. I called my family, ma'am. When you can't handle a problem yourself, you call family. An hour later, the parking lot was quiet again. The SUVs had returned and departed, taking their passengers to facilities where questions would be asked and answers would be demanded. The 5 bikers would face federal charges for assault on a service member, charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences and no possibility of plea bargaining. Frank stood beside his truck, checking that everything was secure. His head still throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. Helen had insisted on giving him a bag of ice and her business card, making him promise to call if he needed anything. Mr. Morrison, she said as he prepared to leave, I'm sorry nobody helped you. I'm sorry I didn't do more. Frank turned to face her, and she was surprised to see understanding rather than anger in his eyes. Ma'am, you did exactly what you should have done. You showed concern for a fellow human being. That's more than most people manage these days. Will those men, will they go to prison? Yes, ma'am. They will, for a long time. Frank's voice carried satisfaction but no vindictiveness. And maybe while they're there, they'll learn that actions have consequences. That elderly people deserve respect, not violence. That service to your country matters. He climbed carefully into his truck, wincing slightly as his head moved. Through the open window, he looked at Helen one more time. Ma'am, I want to thank you for caring. In a world that seems to have forgotten how to do that, it means more than you know. As Frank drove away into the desert night, Helen watched his taillights disappear and realized she'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Not the violence that had been ugly and senseless, not even the arrival of the elite soldiers, though that had been impressive. What had been extraordinary was watching a man who possessed the power to destroy his enemies choose instead to seek justice through proper channels. Frank Morrison could have killed 5 men with his bare hands. Instead, he'd made a phone call and let the system work. He'd chosen civilization over savagery, law over revenge, justice over vengeance. The next morning, the story would spread through the community like wildfire. The arrest of 5 bikers for assaulting a veteran would make the local news, but the full story, the identity of the victim, the rapid response of federal operators, the demonstration of loyalty that transcended decades, and retirement, would remain classified. Frank would return the next Tuesday for gas, just like always. Helen would nod respectfully and make sure his coffee was fresh. Other customers would treat him with a little more deference, though most would never know exactly why. And somewhere in a federal detention facility, 5 men would have plenty of time to think about the night they learned that respect isn't just expected, it's enforced. Because in the end, the brotherhood never dies. The men who earn the trident carry it forever. They carry the responsibility, the honor, and the unbreakable bonds forged in training so brutal it breaks most men before they ever see combat. Frank Morrison had served his country for 23 years, earning decorations most people had never heard of for operations that officially never happened. He trained warriors who went on to protect America in ways the public would never know. He bled for freedom, in jungles and deserts where the enemy was merciless and the margin for error was death. And when 5 drunk bikers decided to have some fun with an old man at a gas station, they discovered that some debts can never be repaid, some bonds can never be broken, and some phone calls can summon hell itself. If you believe respect should never be optional, if you believe service deserves recognition, and if you believe in justice for those who served, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because stories like Frank's remind us that heroes don't retire. They just blend into the crowd until the moment they're needed again. And when that moment comes, they don't stand alone. They never stand alone. The events depicted in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This content is produced using AI assistance and is not intended to represent factual military operations or real individuals.